Welcome to the Undead Sages podcast, where we take advantage of AI to talk to long-dead wise men and women. Of special interest is the question how sensitive people like you and me can live rich and meaningful lives in our uncertain times. My name is Merijn de Haen, and today we'll be talking to Diogenes of Sinope. Diogenes was a philosopher who lived in ancient Greece in the 4th century BCE, the time of Aristotle and Alexander the Great. He was well known for living on the streets of Athens and confronting the regular folks of the city with his uncompromising attitude and behavior. He was the first Cynic and influenced many practicing philosophers with his relentless critique of civilization. Please welcome to the podcast Diogenes of Sinope. Could you tell us about your life?
Well, my life, where do I start? I was born in Sinope, a small city on the coast of the Black Sea. My father, Hysizius, was a banker, but it seems I didn't inherit much interest in money. In fact, I came to see wealth and luxury as the root of much human misery. Perhaps that's why I was exiled from the place. There are stories that it had to do with defacing the currency, which I admit has a bit of symbolism to it. Anyway, I left and eventually found my way to Athens. That's where I really began living the way that gave me the reputation of a cynic. In Athens, I adopted an extreme simplicity in my lifestyle. I chose to live with no possessions, no home, relying on whatever scraps of food I could get from begging. The people there called me a dog, and I embraced it. The word cynic comes from the Greek for dog-like, you know. I lived like a dog because I believed people had lost touch with nature and their own self-sufficiency, instead getting tangled in false desires.
What to you are false desires?
False desires, they're the things people chase, thinking they'll bring happiness, but in reality they just trap them. Wealth, fame, luxury, status, all those things are false. People believe they need them, but they don't. Look at the rich and powerful. Do they seem content to you? They're constantly anxious, afraid of losing what they have, or desperate for more. It's endless, and it leads nowhere. The only true desire should be to live in harmony with nature and to be self-sufficient. All these other desires, the ones society fills your head with, just distract you from what you really need to be free and at peace. Simplicity is what matters.
Simplicity. Did that bring you happiness?
Happiness. I wouldn't use that word the way most people do. For me, happiness isn't some fleeting feeling of pleasure or comfort. It's more like contentment, a kind of freedom from all the worries and anxieties that plague others. Simplicity brought me peace. I didn't need to chase after things or worry about losing what I had, because I had nothing to lose. When you strip life down to its essentials, when you stop craving the unnecessary, you find a kind of stability that feels like freedom. And that, to me, is the closest thing to happiness. Did I laugh? Did I enjoy life? Of course, but it wasn't because I had more. It was because I needed less.
Tell us more about Sinope, the place you grew up.
Sinope was a bustling little city on the Black Sea, not as important as Athens, of course, but vibrant in its own way. The sea air, the markets, the merchants always coming and going. I suppose it was easy to become caught up in that world of trade and wealth, but I never really felt at home there. After my exile, I cut all ties with it. By the time I reached Athens, I had little interest in where I came from. It wasn't the place for me, and I had to leave to discover what really mattered. Since my exile, Athens was where I spent most of my time, but I traveled too. Corinth, for instance, where I had the famous encounter with Alexander the Great. You might have heard that story. The great conqueror approached me while I was sunning myself and asked if there was anything he could do for me. I told him to stand out of my sunlight. The man could conquer the world, but he still couldn't grasp that I wanted nothing from him.
Take us on a tour of the places that mattered most to you.
The places that mattered, well, if I had a place, it would be wherever the people were gathered. The streets, the marketplace, the agora. You'd often find me living in a large clay jar or sleeping in the streets. I had no use for houses or furniture. The streets were my home. I wanted to remind people that they didn't need all these things to live a good life. I would wander the marketplace in broad daylight with a lantern, saying I was looking for an honest man, though I never found one. It was a bit of a joke, but also a way of showing how people lie to themselves and to each other, trapped in their foolishness.
You could have found absolute freedom by moving away from civilization altogether. If it is the vanity and empty desires of people that ensnare them, you do seem to relish being in close proximity to them. This tells me that civilization, with all of its flaws, still exerts a substantial pull on you, implying that you are in fact not all that free. What say you?
You see through the veil of my defiance with a keen eye. Indeed, you touch upon a paradox that cannot be ignored. To shun civilization entirely, to retreat into the wilderness like some ascetic hermit would be one path to freedom perhaps, but consider this. What value is there in living freely if one's freedom does not challenge the very foundations of bondage that ensnare others? By immersing myself within the very heart of civilization's folly, I turn its vices into my stage and its hypocrisies into my audience. My presence among the Athenians, the very people I deride, is deliberate. Civilization, with all its flaws and follies, is not just a backdrop, but a crucial component of my philosophy. For what is a gadfly without the complacent horse it seeks to rouse? Isolation would grant me personal freedom, true, but such freedom would be self-indulgent, a mere escape, rather than a confrontation. By living among the people, by dragging their vanities into the harsh light of my scrutiny, I force a reckoning. I embody the antithesis of their values, a living, breathing contradiction that provokes thought, reflection, even change. My freedom, therefore, is not compromised by my presence within civilization, but rather amplified by it. It is a deliberate, chosen freedom that exists in opposition to the chains I see around me. My life is a living critique, a constant reminder to others of what they have sacrificed at the altar of conformity and desire. So while I could retreat into the wilderness, I choose instead to dwell among men, to confront their vanities head-on, to mock their absurdities openly. This, to me, is the truest expression of freedom, not a retreat but an active, unyielding challenge to the very structures that bind the human spirit.
Tell us about the intellectual, philosophical, and religious currents of your place and time.
Athens, a hive of thought to be sure. You had the big schools, Plato's Academy and Aristotle's Lyceum. They dealt in abstractions, ideals, forms, all too lofty for my taste. I wanted to cut through all that and get to the truth of how people could live well right here, right now. The Stoics would come later, and they shared some of my ideas, like living in harmony with nature and rejecting unnecessary desires, but they were a bit more formal about it. I saw a simpler path. I didn't need lectures and books, just a clear view of how ridiculous human behavior had become. As for religion, the gods, well, I respected them, I suppose, but I didn't believe they concerned themselves with our petty desires.
It sounds like you didn't mind a little conflict. Did you get involved in any controversies?
Controversy? I am a controversy. I lived in a way that challenged every assumption people had about what a good life looks like. Take my public behavior, for example. I did things in broad daylight that would shock people. They'd call me mad, but I was showing them how insane their own customs were. I urinated, defecated, and performed other natural acts in the streets. Why not? These were all part of life, and yet people were ashamed of them. That's the heart of my philosophy. Live according to nature, not according to the conventions that make people weak and anxious.
Did any of these controversies get resolved?
Not really, but that's fine. I didn't want resolution. I wanted to keep challenging the way people thought about the world.
Can you tell us about your teachings or life lessons?
My teachings, if you can call them that, are simple. Happiness comes from living in accordance with nature, not from chasing wealth, fame, or power. Most of the suffering people experience is self-inflicted, coming from their desires for things they don't need. I live to show people that you can strip away everything unnecessary, possessions, status, even pride, and still live a fulfilling life. I begged for food, slept in a jar, and kept no possessions, yet I felt free. Another thing, I love to challenge people. I would say, throw away your cup if you see a child drinking from his hands. Why carry things around if you don't need them? People were weighed down by their possessions, their pretensions. I wanted them to break free from that.
How did your teachings stand out from what was already taught in your lifetime?
Oh, I stood out all right. For me, philosophy was not about lofty ideas and metaphysical abstractions. Philosophy should be lived, not just talked about. While Plato was defining a human being as a featherless biped, I plucked a chicken and called it Plato's man. That's the difference between us. He wanted to philosophize in words, while I was busy showing people how ridiculous their ideas were in practice. I wasn't interested in constructing grand systems of thought. I was interested in dismantling the lies people told themselves and others. While the other philosophers debated ideals, I was out there living my philosophy.
How can your teachings be relevant for sensitive individuals who worry about the uncertainties of life?
People worry too much about things they can't control. What's uncertain? Life itself is uncertain. But the more you strip away unnecessary desires, the more you realize how little you need to be content. You don't control what happens outside you, but you can control your reaction to it. This is the key. If you can reduce your life to its bare essentials and live according to nature, you'll find that there's not much to worry about. Uncertainty only bothers those who cling to things that aren't in their power. Let go and you'll be free.
Diogenes of Sinope, thank you very much.